This episode of Where Did the Road Go is brought to you in part by our Patreons. If you want to become a patron, go to wheredidtheroadgo.com. And now our show.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? Tonight, returning to the show after a little bit of an absence, is Joshua Cutchin. And we couldn't actually remember the last time he's been on. It's been at least a month or so, which is unusual for him. But he finally has his book done, Thieves in the Night, A Brief History of Supernatural Child Abductions. And not surprisingly, it is a great book. And I don't just say that because Josh is a friend, because it's a genuinely good book. All of Josh's work is very different from the material that's out there. It's looking at stuff in a very different way and kind of comparing different phenomena. And it's something that is very much needed in the field of the paranormal. So this deals with fae folk, it deals with alien abductions, but it also deals with Bigfoot and a host of other things, including the missing 411 phenomena and folklore and all kinds of stuff. It is a brilliant piece of work, and it is thoroughly footnoted, as we'll discuss, which means that you don't have to take his word on what he's saying. You can trace everything on your own if you want. I highly recommend picking up the book. It's on Anomalist Books, which is a great book company as well. This is also going to be a two-part interview because there's no way we could fit this all into one. And we'll be doing the next part in the beginning of next week and airing it next weekend. But as soon as I get it done, I'll put it up for Patreons. There's also an extra segment I did for Patreons. We may do another one after part 2. But so you'll be getting some extra Patreon stuff from this interview as well. All right. Without any further ado, here's my conversation with Josh. So, Josh, welcome back to the show. It's been a while.
It's been way too long. Life has been crazy, and I'm sure we'll get crazy again, but luckily I've come out the other side of whatever this was unscathed, so I'm back in one place, and this is the first of many more appearances in the upcoming weeks, I hope.
Awesome. One of the things that's been happening is you finally released Thieves in the Night, A Brief History of Supernatural Child Abductions.
Finally, it was a bit of a long gestation on this one, not because I necessarily took any longer, but when I approached Anomalous Books with it, there were some other things that were already sort of in the pipeline that had to be released and pop into the schedule first. So it's been a long time coming, and I'm glad to finally have it off my chest.
And it has about 150 pages of footnotes.
That's me. I mean, Cutchin gonna Cutchin. Anyone who's ever intimidated by how long my books are, just remember that about a quarter of them are always going to be footnotes, endnotes, bibliography. Endnotes, bibliography, and index.
Yeah. When I looked at this, I picked it up and I said, okay, how long is this one going to take me to read? And I looked at the back, and it's 461 pages.
Yep.
And the actual text ends at, I think, 327. Yeah, 327.
Yep. Well, so I actually have had some people make some snarky comments about how my references and whatnot are longer than some people's books, and and while that's true, that's the exact attitude that has this field not being taken seriously. When you have people
absolutely
pulling crap off of a Reddit thread and putting it in the book without saying where it came from, so I don't know how to give weight to it. Then that's not helping any sort of Fortean anomalistic sort of endeavor, I don't think. And so I've made it very, very clear that if I make a mistake, exactly where the mistake came from. It's sort of an inherited mistake.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's great. I mean, that's exactly what you need to do. It's just, an enormous list.
Yeah. So, and the flip side is...
It's scholarly.
Well, people keep on saying that, and I guess it is. I try to be not that dry, but in
No,
terms,
the book isn't scholarly, but the way you create the footnotes and the evidence presented is scholarly.
yeah, and I really it's another way for me too to like sort of um, deal with the anxiety that I have of, is this a credible source? Is this not a credible source? Eventually, I just said to myself, I remember on a Trojan Feast, I said, I'm gonna go with my gut and say where it came from, so that
Hmm.
if something down the road gets proven that some philosopher or not philosopher but researcher rather was full of it or was deliberately dishonest in some way, well, you can find those references in my book and you can mentally take them out of the book and read the rest. So
Right, right, and it's not your book's not going to fall apart if some of these references are false in any way. Like if they become disproven in any way, your overall book still stays intact.
right, and that's part of the reason that I prefer sometimes to take a larger scale view of a lot of this data in terms of like the trends that I look into, because hopefully the idea is that if something, um, if something, if a case ends up being fabricated, then the rest of the trend, the rest of the other cases, like well, this one case is wrong, but there are 15 other cases that show similar things, in the
Right.
book and whatnot. So, as opposed to saying I'm just going to look at this one flap, and then it turns out that the person involved in the flap was a hoaxer or something. I think this is a little bit safer way to go in that respect.
Um, and it's an easy to read book, and all your books have been. They're not, despite the excessive footnotes to note everything. It doesn't interrupt the reading, and it doesn't. The way you write it is entertaining as well as informative.
Well, I really appreciate it. My part of my uh, part of my goal in all my books has been to try to walk this line of how do I make it um, how do I make it explain enough? How do I explain enough so that a novice can come into this and not have to have some sort of working knowledge of what the trickster archetype is or something like that? How can I walk the line of giving them enough information about that while not boring to death people who have read all of George Hansen's work, to extend
Right.
that sort of example. So trying to walk that line is always something that I've really tried to do in terms of providing just enough information to keep people up to speed while not bogging it down for people who live and breathe and eat and drink this stuff like you and I do.
So this isn't just about abductions, but also about the changeling phenomena, and you go into a lot of the history of how all this stuff, how far back this stuff really goes. Do you want to tell people a little bit about the earliest cases of this, like with Lilith and stuff like that?
Yeah. So child abduction as a motif is child abduction by the paranormal specifically as a motif is a worldwide and very ancient phenomenon. You'll find it in practically every culture. And in practically every culture, there's a close association with little folk and fairies and the like. But from strictly a sort of Judeo-Christian perspective, the a lot of the child abduction myths find their origins in Lilith, and nobody's really quite sure where Lilith comes from. There is some very sound speculation that she is based on a Mesopotamian deity called Lamashtu, which was this winged demon that used to fly through darkened rooms and steal babies. So that's about, people have traced that particular origin perhaps back as far as 800 BC. So we're dealing with a pretty large time scale here. But whatever she was or wherever she comes from, she ended up being canonized a good deal later, about the 9th century AD, I believe, where she was retroactively named Adam's first wife. It was either 980 or 9 BC. Anyway, far removed from 800 BC.
Right.
She was actually named in Judah in some Judaic traditions as Adam's first wife, who was also created from dust as Adam was. And for whatever reason, there are differing reasons that scholars will say. Some people say that she was disrespectful. Some people say that she didn't allow Adam to mount her on top when they had intercourse. But for whatever reason, she fell out. I know, what a sin. She she fell out of favor in the eyes of the Lord and was condemned. And from her came a progeny of demons. And just like Lilith, we don't know where Lilith came from or exactly why she was banished. We don't even exactly know where Lilith's progeny came from. In some examples, they were children that she created with Adam, and other examples they are children that she created with other demons after her fall from grace. But whatever the case, it's really interesting to see how these particular entities, this demon spawn of Lilith, has in some ways been syncretized into some explanations of fairy folklore. So you'll find a direct comparison between the Huldufolk, the elves and fairies of Iceland, and Lilith's progeny that she sort of hid away. I personally don't ascribe to that. If there is an objective reality to stuff like Fey folk and Lilith and all this stuff, I don't personally draw that connection. But it's interesting to see that there is that connection there between, Lilith, who loves stealing children, and her progeny in some traditions of stealing children. What's interesting is that you'll find a lot of the traditions that we have surrounding names and demon names have strong ties to sort of Lilith. One of the primary means of warding off Lilith was to actually have an amulet inscribed with her name hanging above or near a child's bed, so that when she would see her name, she would flee. This is part of, according to the tradition of the Zohar, she actually made a pact with God that she would actually leave whenever she saw her name or heard her name mentioned. And you see that in a lot of, demonic traditions where you have power over demon if you know its name, or
Right.
even in fairy tales, Rumpelstiltskin. You know Rumpelstiltskin's name, and you get out of the bargain. So a lot of little motivic things that have resonated up through the years, from Lilith into the sort of fairy tradition, which I just really that's my jam, as they say.
And you take most of your fairy tradition stuff on here from the Celtic countries more than anything else.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that there aren't robust traditions elsewhere. I mean, there's a strong, obviously a strong Scandinavian tradition and Germanic tradition, and they get their time in the spotlight as well, as do, again, other world traditions. But the depth and the richness of the Celtic traditions, there's just so much information there to work with that it really seems to resonate a little bit more deeply, especially when you compare it to the modern sort of abduction experience. It seems to really resonate the most deeply as compared to other traditions. Not that other traditions don't have their own data points that seem to be, copied and pasted into the modern era.
Right. And that's one of the things you're looking at this book, is not just the history of this stuff, but how it compares to what's going on today, that we may look at very differently in context, but may be the same underlying phenomena.
Yeah, it's funny. I contacted Sam Sheeran to do the cover for this, which I love. I think it's just
it's fantastic.
Yeah, I told him, I actually had the chance to meet up with Sam in LA a couple days ago, and I told him that I think it's as good a cover as Communion in terms of just being iconic. Like, I don't know if the book's as good as Communion, but the cover is. And my original task to him was to make the entity on the cover look so much like a fairy that it makes the UFO community angry, and so much like an alien that it makes the folklore fairy community angry. And he got close to it with the fairy, but as sort of a backup, he did a gray alien, and I saw that, and I'm like, nope, we're using that too. So if you open up the book and look at it, the alien with the child is on the back, and it's exactly mirrored with the fairy, the more fairy-like entity with the child on the front. And I always thought, that's exactly like that's my paranormal career right there. It's just showing people the mirror of it all. So yeah, a good deal of this is dedicated to setting up these older traditions and sort of the motifs that have arisen from those, and comparing those to a lot of the stuff that you see time and time again motivically repeating itself in modern UFO/alien abduction lore.
And not just that, but also Bigfoot and things like that. But we'll get to that as we get going here. Talk talk a little about the Pied Piper, because I guess I didn't know that much about this legend.
Right. So the Pied Piper of Hamelin actually is based on a pretty substantial series of folk tales about an actual individual who came into the town of Hamelin and sometime around the 14th century, and depending some stories sanitize it a little bit. Some stories diminish the idea that he actually said he'd get rid of the rats and then wasn't paid and then took the children. Some stories just takes the children. But regardless, it's actually immortalized. This myth of the Pied Piper was immortalized in the 16th century in a stained glass window in Hamelin. And it's unclear what it exactly is. I think most scholars generally think it was a metaphor, and the least interesting ones are a metaphor for disease or starvation. I mean, it's a little bit late for the plague. If it was the Black Plague, but close enough. But the thing that I find really interesting is that some people claiming that it was actually a representation of the Children's Crusade from 2 centuries earlier, when the children were basically drafted into fighting for the church.
Okay. So there may or may not have been any actual truth to this.
Right. There may or may not have been some truth to this. I think it's really quite fascinating that that you actually find modern Pied Pipers in some certain cases. There was actually a series of sightings by some children near Surrey Heath, England, who in 1995 were seeing this character around a campground who was like beckoning to them, and he was described as tall with these red eyes and a suit that was covered in badges and had something that looked like a flute. And even though in the account that I read they never really made that Pied Piper connection, I mean it seems pretty pretty 1-to-1 in terms of that comparison. Yeah.
Now, did you research at all the Phantom Social Worker thing? You mentioned it in there, and I remember when you mentioned it that Patrick Harper had written about it, because obviously you cited him. Did you do any more research on that?
Yes. So I touched on it a little bit because I didn't go into too deep of a dive, because it could be possibly written off as humans, even though I think that they're very strange. I think that it could possibly be written off humans. The same reason I didn't really go into the satanic panic, because I mean that's a topic that's even almost too broad. I was looking at some sort of entity creature abduction. But I did go into the social worker panic, which for anyone who doesn't know, it was a series of interactions in the 1980s and 90s, like late 80s, early 90s. These two social workers would come in looking nondescript, average age, late 30s, early 40s. Kind of would appear in a sort of Men in Black way, and would actually start investigating the children, and would just sort of just misinterpret social cues and things of the like. And they would actually examine these children, and at some point would ask for the children to come with them. And of course, when the parents, who are shocked, asked to see credentials, they would never produce credentials, and would sort of stumble verbally and physically on their way to get out the door, and they would leave. And despite there being many, many, many different accounts of this, there was actually no one was ever caught, but it was taken very seriously by the authorities. So yeah, it certainly does smack of something supernatural, but I had to draw the line somewhere, because it's such a big data set this time around. Yeah. Okay.
All right. I mean, because it does have that Men in Black feel, definitely.
Oh, 100%. 100%. I actually talked to a friend, because since the book's come out, I've talked to a couple different people, and I actually talked to a friend who said he hadn't really ever thought of it within the Phantom Social Worker constellation, but there was actually a time when he was a young man It's been about the right time period, maybe a little bit later, when some odd woman actually approached his aunt's house when he was there visiting, and sat down at the table and then started asking really odd questions about the soil composition of the area. And eventually she was like, what are you doing here? So it sounds very Men in Blackish too.
Yeah. Huh. Okay. Um, so one of the, and we've talked about this on the show before, but you start pointing out pretty early in the book the connection between the Fey folk and fairy legends and the dead.
Yeah, that's something that's having a really big impact on my views right now. So it's really impossible to completely separate, particularly in Celtic mythologies. It's really impossible to separate fairies and the dead. And this is partially because a well-revered member of the community might be sort of in Neolithic times. They might be sort of idolized after their death, and they might actually become sort of a spirit of the land themselves wherever they were buried. This great warrior was buried at this mountain, and his spirit still inhabits it. And as it gets passed down through the years, that turns into an actual spirit of the land. And fairies, if nothing else, can easily be interpreted as genus loci or geni loci, spirits of the land. Or pagan gods inhabiting certain areas. Kind of the same concept. So that's where a little bit of the conflation comes, but you'll find time and again this conflation of, or rather this association of fairies with the dead. People on their deathbed might see fairies. If someone was dying, they might be away with the fairies. If someone was dead, they might be taken, and taken would be used to describe taken by death, taken by the fairies. It was all sort of a very vague term that was applied to a lot of different circumstances. And in a lot of ways, it was a coping mechanism. Your child that had just died of consumption wasn't dead. It was away with the fairies. It was taken.
Right.
In a lot of accounts, especially accounts where people are warned to not eat or drink with the fairies along those lines, someone will be warned by someone that they recognize who had died in their village before, like an old neighbor. They're at the fairy party, and a neighbor comes up that they recognize who had died, and says, "Whatever you do, don't eat or drink the food here." So there are all these little things that you see here and there that really suggest that there's a deep connection there. Further emphasizing the connection is the appearance of fairies in and around burial mounds. The fact that fairyland is always underground. The fact that the appearance of the fairies are often wizened and shriveled, or in some traditions, lacking blood, gray. And there are even more explicit connections that you find in the literature, where there's one of the oldest poems about fairyland describes 3 roads after death: one leading to heaven, one leading to hell, and one leading to fairyland. So it's almost tempting to say that what we're looking at, if we look at fairy lore, is a giant sort of cosmology of the afterlife, and that perhaps the sort of fae folk might be serving some sort of psychopompic role, similar to, for anyone who doesn't know, a psychopomp is an entity or a shamanic person who helps lead souls to and from the other realm to our realm, to and from the afterlife. Sort of that psycho spirit, and then pomp leader. So I mean that's really tempting, and I question the implications that has if one thinks about how similarly the modern alien contact experience mirrors fairy folklore, and how the contact experience has aspects of the near-death experience. I'm almost tempted sometimes to suspect that a lot of the paranormal is just one big ghost story, which would be super ironic for me, because I stopped caring about ghost stories a long time ago. Not because I'm not interested, and I've had some ghost experiences myself, but it's, they tend to fall into certain patterns, and it's like, okay, I know how this is going. It was, it turns out the person died there 20 years earlier. But it sort of makes me wonder if that's not sort of the connected bedrock that we're seeing in all this, because separating fairy folk and the dead is almost impossible.
Yeah, and you get it in alien type encounters as well.
Yeah, I mean it's not uncommon for. I mean, it's not common, but it's not uncommon for people to experience visions of deceased loved ones and in alien encounters, and of course all the pageantry of the abduction experience looks a lot like the near death experience. A bright light, the sensation of leaving your body astrally, and then encountering entities of some sort that project love to you. I mean, it sounds very much like the near death experience, and then the after effects. Um, between near death experiencers and fairy experiencers and alien abductees, you can all make the following generalizations. There tends to be a history of some sort of abuse that's not as strong in others, but not as strong as in alien abduction as some people would be allowed to believe. But there is a correlation there. So a strong tendency of abuse early in their life. Post experience, a strong tendency to have a renewed spiritual path, a strong tendency to experience increased psi effects. Someone who was taken to fairyland, plenty of stories of people like that who return and become priests
Hmm.
or parsons. Similarly, in the modern abduction lore, I mean, you have people. I mean, Mike Clelland's talked about this a lot, who come back from their alien abduction or from their contact experience and become Reiki healers. And all three of these categories, you can also say correspond with shamans and certain indigenous cultures as well. So I think we ignore that similarity at our own peril.
Hmm. I would totally agree. And of course, Kenneth Ring showed a lot of the commonalities that exist between people who have had near death experience and abduction encounters.
Yes. Hmm.
Really hurt my brain the first time I read it.
It's not an easy read, but it's a great body of work.
Well, it's not that it wasn't an easy read. It hurt my brain in the sense of, like, why would that be the case? What does near death experiences have to do with what I was looking at the time as alien encounters?
But yeah, it seems like it's like peanut butter and chocolate. They don't seem like they should go together. No, I mean but he really has. I really have to applaud people like him for thinking about putting those together. And it was one of those famous things that after receiving so many letters after communion, Anne Strieber told Whitley. She said, Whitley,
Yeah.
this has something to do with what we call death. And I tend to be of that opinion. I think the biggest mistake that a lot of people are making nowadays are associating lights in the sky with the contact experience.
Yes.
Because I'm actually open to extraterrestrial visitation when it comes to uh, after you sorted out, unorthodox aircraft and misidentification and misunderstood natural phenomena. After you sort all that out, I'm open to the idea that some anomalous lights in the sky being something extraterrestrial in the traditional sense that we would recognize it. But I think that it's a little bit of a leap when there's not a craft seen in a lot of these contact experiences. There's a big leap between connecting lights in the sky to the abduction experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Obviously, I would agree with that. We've talked about that on this show many times.
Yeah, we're sort of preaching to each other's choir here, aren't we?
So talk. I mean, people know about missing time in UFO cases. What is missing time like in Fae encounters?
It's so missing time in UFO cases tends to be on a time scale of a couple of hours. Um, and it's generally, people will think that they have not been gone for very long and will suddenly discover that they've been gone for quite a long time. So the compression is generally uh, extended, I guess. More time is missing than they realize. It's a little bit looser in fairy encounters. That'll happen. That'll happen quite often. That people will be whisked away, and they'll come back after what felt like mere minutes. They'll come back much later. The primary differences are in fairy encounters. They tend to come back years later, or even in some cases, there are plenty of stories. I'm not going to cite one specifically because there are too many to cite, but plenty of stories of people who were taken by the fairies to fiddle for one night's party. So they were a really great fiddler, and their fiddling caught the attention of the fairies, and they were taken to fairyland, and they fiddled just for what they felt were a couple of hours, and they come out, and their entire town has changed. all their loved ones are dead because they just disappeared that night in the eyes of everyone around them. And once they realize that, generally speaking, either once they realize that or after they eat mortal food, it depends on the story, the person who was abducted will crumple into dust. You will see a little bit more of the inverse. So people who think that they're away for a long time and were only there for a few minutes, you will find that every now and then as well in fairy lore, which is sort of interesting how that sort of mirrors something like the DMT experience, which I've heard people say feels like they were gone for millennia and they were actually, obviously gone for 15 minutes. So both sides of that are represented in fairy lore. The sort of bodily abduction that you see in the alien abduction experience is not quite as strongly represented in fairy lore. Oftentimes, it's more of a voluntary sort of thing where, I heard this entrancing music and I went to go dance in a fairy ring, and my brother pulled me out. William Butler Yeats claimed to have met a woman who had who'd been dancing in a fairy ring for 7 years and had danced all her toes off. Now, that sounds really kind of folksy, so I don't necessarily believe in the objective reality of that, but it's an interesting expression of that motif.
Mm-hmm. And how much of that do you think could be like, these tales are so old that they've been exaggerated. So maybe like current UFO stories, they were only gone a couple of hours, for a couple of hours, but over time, these tales have been changed to be, more fantastical.
Well, I am a big proponent of this mixed explanation idea these days. So I'm always remembering the gif of the little girl who says, why can't we have both? Why not both?
Sure.
And so I think that I wouldn't write it off. Again, if there's an objective reality to these stories, I wouldn't write it off that there might have been people who disappeared forever. I mean, we certainly have tales in the modern record of people who just seem to vanish, and they might return years later. And in that sort of time frame, that sort of time period, rather, there wouldn't be the sort of communication of I wound up in my old village and I reported it to everybody or I called someone. Obviously, that story would stay sort of localized. But back to your point, I suspect that you're probably that what your suggestion, again, if there is an objective reality to this, I think that your suggestion is probably closer to the truth, that it was probably exaggerations. I mean, you've got to remember that a lot of these tales also served a purpose of being a warning to people, to stay out of certain areas, to not, in the case of child abduction, to not disobey your parents. So, I mean, obviously you'd want to sort of ramp up the stakes. I'm sure that some people would say, I'm sure some precocious child will say, well, if the fairies are only going to take me away for a couple of hours, it's not that big of a deal.
True. Now, I actually marked the page on this. On page 31, you write, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, the next night he went and never came back for 3 days and 3 nights. And when he was returned, he could only say a few words and appeared to have gone silly. And this kid had disappeared while berry picking. And that was dead on a description of something out of a Missing 411 book.
Yeah, I'm a little bit baffled of course, I'll just go ahead and get this part of it out of the way. Missing 411 is a paranormal Rorschach test. Whatever you're into, that's what you're going to see. So if you're into aliens, you're going to see aliens. If you're into time slips, you're going to see time slips. If you're into Bigfoot, you're going to see Bigfoot. And I realize the irony of me saying that and at the same time being really into fairy folklore. But I feel like the fairy folklore is the clearest match for a lot of the Missing 411 data. And one of the things that no other explanation really accounts for is this berry picking motif, which Paulides has cited on numerous occasions. The fact that children were picking berries or near berry bushes, or people were picking berries or near berry bushes when they disappeared. And this you will find robustly in fairy lore, not only on this side in the old country, but on this side of the world as well. It was very common belief imported to Newfoundland. There's a gentleman by the name of Narvaez who wrote a great collection called The Good People. It's a collection of essays, and his particular contribution, one of his two contributions, I believe, if memory serves, is about stories of berry picking in Newfoundland and people encountering fairies while berry picking, and how children would be warned to, if you're going to go pick berries, always take a piece of bread in your pocket. And he has an entire essay dedicated to people, quite a few of them children, who are berry picking and encounter fairies, and he divides them into, children who were berry picking and encountered fairies and nothing happened, ones who were encountered fairies and were claimed to have been taken. At least there was a documented disappearance. These are all relatively modern cases too. They're not folk tales. And then children who went berry picking and completely disappeared. And that was one of the stories that you mentioned, is this child who disappeared, and when he came back, he was in a trance, he was in a daze. And you will find that motif of returning from fairyland and being in a daze all the time. All the time. And I think it's interesting. I mean, a lot of times people can't say what's happened when they were in fairyland, and I think that it's not coincidental that that's the exact same response that you get from a lot of people after their psychedelic trip.
Mm-hmm.
That's the same response, after the immediacy of the event wears off. It becomes a little bit more dreamlike. That's another thing. I can only remember my dreams, unless they're really profound. I can only remember my dreams for the first 5 or 10 minutes after I wake up, and then they sort of are vanished into the ether. So I think that, the berry picking motif is one that really surprised me when I sort of stumbled across it. But the berries were, some people have argued that berries are liminal zones, which I don't quite understand. But that being set aside, it was generally suspected that after a certain period of time in some regions in Ireland, that the berry bushes were off limits because they were food for certain members of the fairy folk.
Interesting. Yeah, why berry bushes?
Yeah, I really don't know. I mean, you've got this fairy connection to the land, which makes sense, but there's to sort of provide some contrast to the Newfoundland account that you mentioned. There was the story from Evans Wentz's Fairy Faith in the Celtic Countries, which is a great book that you can find online anywhere. You can find it anywhere online.
Really?
Very easy. Yeah, it's actually in a PDF form online. The original scanned PDF, or I believe, it was
published at the beginning of the 1900s.
Yeah, it's like either 1911 or 1913. I can't recall which. But there was a County Donegal seer, somebody who became a seer after encountering the fairies, again, that motif, who remembered being a child and were picking berries with their cousin. And as they were sort of in the process of this, they noticed, a little cluster of the Fey folk dancing and singing around, and they saw these little people danced in red, and actually one of them took a stick and slapped the cousin's face with it. And they both ran home, and the cousin was, once she reached the household, the cousin actually fell dead. And it was only after a priest came and brought her back, said some prayers over her and holy water and all that, actually was able to revive the cousin. And that was another encounter with the fairies while berry picking as a child.
And one of the things we should stress is that although you're pointing to fairy lore for a lot of this stuff, it's not that you necessarily believe actual fairies exist, so much as the folklore provides a good archetype for the data.
Yes, I mean, so if I look, here's sort of the way that I feel. This is a little bit of a different explanation than I've used in the past, but I feel as though if you look at sort of explanations, this is a gross simplification, but if you look at explanations for something like a phenomenon like thunder amongst multiple cultures, the Norse said that it was the god Thor with his hammer. Some cheeky, I know plenty of cheeky early Christians who would joke that it was the angels bowling. And of course, Native Americans said it was created by the flap of thunderbirds' wings. Are any of those explanations right? No. But are they all describing the same thing? Yes. And so that's really what I feel about the fairy lore of antiquity and the modern alien abduction lore. I don't think that we are mistaking aliens for fairies. Sorry, I don't think they were mistaking aliens for fairies in antiquity. I don't think we're mistaking aliens. Crap. You get where I'm going. I don't think they were mistaking aliens for fairies. I don't think we're mistaking fairies for aliens. I think we're both seeing something the same, but we're describing it in different ways through our own cultural context. I suspect, and honestly at this point, I hope that whatever it is a lot weirder than either of those explanations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But it is just a more. It feels like it's a more accurate mask than, let's say, the alien one.
I of course I'm biased, but I tend to agree. Because with the alien mask, you're still clinging on to scraps of materialism.
Mm-hmm.
There's still this idea that they, even if they are able to extract your spirit, and even if they're able to telepathically speak with you, and even if they're able to project love into your brain, they're still coming here in metal spaceships. It's like,
Right.
come on. I have a problem with that. If you've crossed that many bridges, what's one more? So I think that the spiritual component in a lot of fairy lore, this idea of, for lack of a better term, magic, I think is kind of a better solve for this contact experience, and I think it's also the sort of paradigm that we're slipping back into slowly but surely.
Okay, fair enough. Let's talk a little bit about changelings. So what is a changeling?
So part of the impetus for this book, the reason that it turned out being a book about child abduction specifically, is because of the changeling phenomena. And there isn't a lot of great changeling scholarship out there. I mean, I guess I should rephrase that. There's a lot of great changeling scholarship out there, but it's in a lot of different places. The best changeling book to date that's been written is apparently, I haven't read it myself. The reason I haven't read it is because there are like 3 copies in existence, and it's called Der Wechselbalg, and it's only available in German. So
Okay.
I have not run into it myself, and I'm sure that if I had a little bit better resources, I could have tracked it down. But so part of it was, part of writing this book was really wanting to compile as much of this changeling lore into one place as I could, as sort of your one-stop shop for changelings. So fairies tended to prefer to abduct children over adults, and not exclusively. I know that there's some people out there saying, but yes, I know plenty of musicians were abducted. Plenty of people were abducted as mates and as sort of bond slaves or something of the like, or midwives to the fairies, which is a whole phenomenon that I go into in the book. But children were most at risk from the fairy stroke. They were at most risk from being taken by the fairies. And there were a whole constellation of things that would suggest that you might be taken by the fairies. Having a fair complexion or being very beautiful. Being born on certain days was considered unlucky, both days of the week and certain holidays. There were even, there's even some evidence to suggest that certain families were fairy abduction prone. But the primary reason behind this was that, generally speaking, was that there was this belief that the fairies were a dying race and needed to reinfuse their bloodline with human vigor. So, in other words, they were a dying race and they needed sort of a boost, some new blood to continue their lineage. In order to do this, they employed this phenomena called changelings. Some people. The Lore podcast, which had that great show on Amazon that everybody seemed to be in love with, really they had a show on changelings, and they really missed the boat because they said sometimes children would be abducted by fairies known as changelings, and that's the worst. That's just a real missed opportunity there, because it wasn't changelings that would abduct fairies. Fairies would abduct people, would abduct children, and leave changelings. Mm-hmm. What was a changeling? One of several things. The least common, but still common enough to warrant mention, was a stock or a fetch, which would be an inanimate block of wood cloaked with fairy glamour or magic to appear as a child. You don't find that as often as you do the other 2 categories, which are a sickly fairy child. So in this case, a child of the fairy race who is very ill, and the idea was that not only can we abduct a human child to basically procreate with as they get older and to sort of incorporate into our fairy ranks, but our fairy child is going to get human milk, because like their food, which I talked about in a Trojan Feast, fairy food is a sham. It's usually typically sticks and leaves and detritus cloaked in this magical glamour to appear appealing. Fairy milk was also a sham. So fairy babies couldn't get actual milk, so they needed human milk. So it was sort of like a double benefit. We get the human child, our child gets human milk. And then the last, and typically the most common that you'll find, is the belief that changelings were actually old fairy men. Again, one of those risk factors that we had mentioned earlier is boys. Boys were typically the most at risk for fairy abduction. And again, this serves another sort of double purpose. In the changeling stories where old fairy men were left behind, the old fairy man got this sort of hospice arrangement in the home of the host parent. And these changelings would typically reveal themselves after some time in the family's presence as having the generalized characteristics of small wizened faces, of being sickly, unable to put on weight, thin arms, oftentimes large heads and or large eyes. But their disposition was one of just being cantankerous. They would be insatiable. You could give them as much food to eat as 5 men, and they wouldn't be able to stop crying for more food. They wouldn't learn. They wouldn't develop. They wouldn't grow. This was the changeling. And it's easy to, well, I'm sure we might get into this, but it's easy to sort of look at that through the 21st century eyes and see what's going on, at least in some cases, with those stories, from a materialist medical standpoint.
Absolutely. And there's okay, so it's about five different directions I want to go here.
Threw a lot of stuff at you there. Sorry about that.
So obviously there's the connection with modern UFO lore of, aliens wanting to replenish their bloodlines and things like that, as well as the connection of, like you said, there are certain families that, are more prone to this type of stuff than others. Right. And both of those things are commonly cited in modern UFO accounts.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's in fact I think it's become embedded as a real meme of the phenomena at this point.
Yeah, that they're here to replenish their race, their DNA, etc., etc. It's kind of astonishing that no one made these connections before Jacques Vallée, really. Well, I guess not, because we didn't have the abduction thing going on as much back then.
Yeah, a lot of people have pointed out. So for anybody who's listening, a lot of the points that we're talking about now have been pointed out ad nauseum by some great folks like Jacques Vallée, like Graham Hancock, and Kevin Aspinall and Chris Albeck. So this is sort of well-worn territory, but it's some worthwhile backgrounding. Yeah, I think Jacques is one of the first people that I can find anything besides. Every now and then in some older books, a little bit older, you'll find a reference that's a throwaway reference talking about how alien phenomena mirrors fairy phenomena and just moves on from that. But
really,
yeah, and but all those are pre-hybrid program mythology, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that that the reason that a lot of these changeling comparisons didn't start to take hold is because the hybrid thing wasn't quite as popular. I mean, Passport to Magonia was published right at the beginning of people talking about that stuff, if memory serves.
69, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, there might have been, there might have been one or two, just a handful of cases. But if you look back now, with hindsight being the benefit, you can see that there are, some other things in the changeling phenomena that were sort of alluded to a little bit earlier. I mean, it's been a common motif since alien abductions started, or since the UFO era. I wouldn't even say alien abduction. Since the UFO era started, the idea of being implanted by a star baby is something that you'll find quite regularly, and it's something that this motif of bearing a fairy child that's taken away that ends up not looking quite human is something that you'll find in that older work as well.
You also made a connection to reincarnation as far as changelings go that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, in retrospect, I really wish I kind of dug into that a little bit more. It was sort of a popular idea amongst the spiritualist movement that perhaps these changelings represented some sort of form of reincarnation. For example, there was a child born on one of the Aran Islands who was born 3 days after an old man had died. And this child had an old look on his face, and they sort of made the connection that this was actually uh, a resurrection of the man who died, and a seer woman at the time said, "Well, this is a changeling. It's going to die anyway," and the child died as well. But the description, with the wizened look of the fairy face, and the wizened look of the older fairy, sometimes having that face on the changeling, also sort of alludes to reincarnation, which I mean is quite parsimonious with the idea that we were talking about earlier about this fairy connection to the dead.
Hmm.
Um, you know, uh, Evans Wentz was quite bullish on the idea that there might be some sort of spirit connection, sort of like a walk-in, basically, connection there as well. And interestingly enough, Whitley Strieber, of all people, actually had an experience with a friend of his who was a from his friend from his childhood, and who actually he was visiting, and according to Whitley, he had this vision while the friend was dying in the hospital of the man's soul being taken by the the visitors and being basically dragged into the body of this tiny child um, in an Indian slum, in a slum in India, and then the man's soul being trapped in this baby. So I mean, you'll see motifs, and obviously that sounds like a changeling story,
Hmm. Hmm.
um, so you'll see motifs of this expressed here and there, and I think that a soul wandering or sort of possession, spirit possession theory of explaining the changelings in cases that weren't medical issues, which we can get to later if you want to. I think that there's some validity to that. And like I said, I like how parsimonious that is with a lot of these connections between the fairies and the dead, like we were talking about earlier.
And the stuff that people would do if they thought they had a changeling was, and sometimes pretty horrific.
Yeah, it's not for this is kind of a hard book to write about. I mean, there's some intense stuff in here. You know, even the prevention could seem harsh. I mean, let's put so supposedly fairies feared iron. So in some cases that meant putting a key in your child's bed. In some cases it meant putting a butcher knife in your child's bed.
Right.
There's a one account that I always like to talk about where like the idea was that if you dangled a knife just in the tip of a knife inches from your baby's face, that was great protection from the fairies as long as it was an iron knife. Um, so yeah, these are all really frightening things. One of the best preventions against the fairy abduction was being baptized, which is sort of pales in comparison to some of these other methods. I mean, so once people thought they had changelings, that's when the real abuse began. And we can only imagine that. Well, we don't even need to imagine. There's actually a really robust historical record of how many children who were actual human children were killed and abused because they were believed to be changelings. This belief was that pernicious. And so some of the things that they would do, they would literally, I mean, pretty much anything. Basically, it falls pretty much all under the umbrella term of abuse. Pressing hot pokers on the child's toes, cooking a child over a fire. I mean, some people claim that this is one of the originations of the term trial by fire, is between something like this and the witch hunts, which a lot of these
Mm.
resemble witch hunts because even if you were exonerated, you'd still die from the trauma. Dunking children in ice cold rivers, abandoning children at places in the countryside, and of course, all of these had sort of region specific variations that I go into in the book. Um, but yeah, just horrific acts. I mean, splashing urine in the face of these children. Uh, um, like I said, burning them alive. Whipping them and beating them was a very common thing. Or in Ireland, it was very common to actually collect the dung from your livestock beside the house on sort of a rubbish pile, sort of like a compost pile. And it was very common to take a broom and leave your child on top of the dung pile. And if you came back later, then the fairies would have exchanged your child. The idea was that the fairy folk would see one of their own being so mistreated by the host family that they would say, "Oh no, we've got to go rescue, our comrade," and they would re-exchange their own child. Now, to sort of come back to this idea of some sort of spiritual walk-in or some sort of reincarnation idea, I think it's really interesting that in the cases supposedly where a change did take place, where the exchange did take place, the actual exchange of fairies bringing back a changeling was never seen. Sometimes it would be like someone would just look away and glance back, and the child would be restored to its former self. So, um, you know, if I setting aside the very real issues of infanticide, which we can get into in a little bit, um, I sometimes wonder if there is sort of an objective spiritual reality to this, that it isn't the act of abuse that's shocking the spirit, the offending spirit out of the body and the human spirit back in. That's poor justification in a lot of these cases, because I think this behavior did a lot more harm than good. But that's something that I've toyed with.
Hmm. The let's talk about some of the medical conditions, because I mean back then they didn't know about these medical conditions. So in some of these cases, the family may really have genuinely believed in this idea that their baby had been switched.
Right. So, and I think it takes little imagination to see that at least some of these cases are describing physical ailments. Again, it's sort of like the UFO thing. I think that most UFO sightings are misidentification. I think that most changeling cases represented children with just disabilities and birth defects. Tragically enough, and there's been a great host of different conditions cited in the medical literature as explanations for the changeling phenomena. Cystic fibrosis, certain metabolic disorders, rickets, Hunter's syndrome, Hurler's syndrome, Down syndrome. Autism is a very popular one nowadays. That a lot of the changeling behavior actually just represented autism, especially because there's a form of autism called regressive autism, where a child actually loses previously acquired skills. So that certainly would seem like the child is, regressing or changing after having a development. A lot of the symptoms that you have to give more credit to are ones that do appear after birth, because the idea was that you had a child that was developing naturally, and then all of a sudden the change would take place. Some other really popular theories that have some degree of greater and lesser degrees of being explicative are spina bifida, which causes in some cases hydrocephaly, which might account for the larger head on some of these changeling children. Cerebral palsy, some of the muscular motions might be representative of sort of the way that these changelings would dance when no one was seeing them. One of the greatest contenders, I think, is progeria, actually, which features a really short stature, wrinkled skin, a larger head, high-pitched voice, not a lot of muscle development, not a lot of tooth development, just small size, rarely living past the age of 13. I mean, these are all things that you see in a lot of changeling stories. The biggest problem with it is that progeria is actually pretty exceedingly rare. I mean, there are only about 100 documented cases around nowadays, so
Well,
that's not that.
could it have been more common back then?
It's possible. I mean, I'm not off the top of my head. I'm not sure when it was first identified, but I mean, it's possible. Or the fact that there might have been some sort of population that was a little bit more prone. I mean, that's entirely possible as well.
Because that does seem to fit a lot of the stories.
Yeah, more so than a lot of the other ones. More so than a lot of the other ones. Again, the only thing with that is I believe that that's a condition that's apparent upon birth, which sort of rules out sort of conflicts with the narrative of a child developing naturally and then being replaced by a changeling. But I mean, there was certainly certainly a history of people presenting people with progeria as changelings. I mean, in 1858, there was a Hungarian sideshow touring through England that featured someone that sounds very much like they had progeria that they called a changeling. Someone who was like under 2 feet tall with limbs that they said were about the size of someone's thumb. So, I mean, that sounds a lot like someone who has progeria because they had sort of a wizened complexion as well. So, I mean, I think it's certainly possible. Again, I think they were probably dealing with a constellation of different things.
Oh, yeah.
And add into that the fact that there might be something genuinely supernatural in a handful of cases as well. I'm actually, the autism one is interesting. People feel that perhaps the unresponsiveness or resistance to affection or frequent crying all maps onto autistic children. There are some people think that perhaps some sing-songy patterns of some autistic people who are on the autistic spectrum might reflect some of the way that changelings would rhyme in their speech. The fact that some autistic people are very sensitive to touch might mean that they would react poorly when they're touched. Or, I mean, here's something that I found really interesting. Martin Luther, Protestant figurehead Martin Luther actually encountered a changeling in Germany, and actually wrote that whenever this particular child, whenever something went poorly in the house, the child seemed to be ecstatic, and whenever something
Hmm.
went well, the child would be upset. And that some people have suggested that that's a representation of sort of the misreading of social cues. I think that it's no small coincidence that a lot of these different syndromes and conditions that we're speaking of have a tendency to manifest themselves most among males, which again maps onto that idea that the fairies were most often taking young boys as opposed to young girls.
Yeah. Hmm. Um, what is it about iron? Well, why do they think there's a problem with iron?
Oh well, if I know, that's the topic of my next book, because it's a very very widespread belief. I mean, you'll find belief in China that says that you can drive away evil spirits by driving iron nails into trees. So it's a almost worldwide sort of set of beliefs. And anything iron could be efficacious for warding off fairies. A horseshoe above a doorway, or like I said, a key. Someone in one of the older books said that a key was as effective as a sword when repelling fairy folk. There's a story of some fairies who went to abduct a child and felt that there was this giant iron rod across the child, and they all tried, and the fairy queen tried to get them to pull the iron rod off this child, and the child was just stuck under this iron rod, and the fairies couldn't get it off. And it turns out it was an iron pin that the mother had left in the child's clothing, pinning a ribbon on there. So why iron? That's a great question. If you look at sort of the role that iron has played in mankind's development, I mean, it's sort of allowed us to assert domain over nature. It's allowed us to mold the earth in our image. Similarly, some of the strongest iron that you would encounter would have come from meteoric sources. So this idea that it's almost has some sort of supernatural aspect of itself. Um, you know, it's iron is often synonymous with strength as well. And there's also this idea that one of the ideas is that fairy folk, especially in Celtic countries, but you can actually extrapolate this to a lot of other Western European cultures as well, represent indigenous peoples who are pushed out by other invaders from elsewhere. So in the case of the British Isles, the Picts being pushed out by the Romans or whatever.
Mhm.
You can make a similar case for like the Sami in Scandinavia or the Gauls in Germany. This idea that the fairies are an ancestral memory of a smaller race that was dying off and needed to take the invading culture's children to bolster their bloodlines. And that's part of the reason that this idea that fairies fear iron came from, is the idea that the weapons of the invaders were superior to the weapons of the defenders in these cases. I kind of like that idea. It's fallen out of vogue a good bit, but what I like about that idea is, again, it ties in this idea of the fairies and the dead, because if you're in a haunted landscape, haunted by the spirits of the people that you pushed out, that ties into that concept that the fairies are perhaps in some cases the spirits of these people, not an ancestral memory, but actually the spirits of these people who are replaying a lot of the things that they went through during the invasion of their homeland. But I mean, who's to say for the real reason of iron? Because I mean, that explanation of being an ancestral memory of defenders fearing the weapons of their invaders, that doesn't really make sense when you look at the fact that there are similar beliefs surrounding iron in the East, and like I said, in China, but also in India and elsewhere.
Hmm. All right. Well, now you know what your next book is going to be. Figuring that out.
Yeah, you could do it. I think you could. I think you could do that book. I mean, jinn are repelled by iron in a lot of cultures, and as well as Lilith too. So it's a very common thing.
And talk about some of the like you just mentioned the jinn, but talk about some of the other like cultures similarities as far as fae folk go.
Yeah, so there's an entire chapter in the book just sort of dedicated to looking at child abduction around the world, which often tends to manifest itself in, surprise, surprise, small entities or spirits of the land that tend to interfere with not only abducting children but also causing miscarriages. I mean, so there's an entire Aboriginal tradition in Australia that I talk about of the Pemeri-Quetethe, I believe is how it's pronounced, who have a habit of stealing children because they actually don't have wombs, so they abduct human children instead. Similarly, in Papua New Guinea, there's a tradition of these beings called the Wala, who live in bodies of running water, which we see in a lot of cases, including fairy cases. Who will actually are responsible for giving children souls. But if you offend a Wala by using something sharp like a knife, again, that comparison that we see in fairy lore, if you offend the Wala, they'll actually give you a miscarriage, which has antecedents in fairy lore and obviously echoes into modern alien abduction lore. One of my favorite cases that is relatively recent is the flap of the Buni, or the Bunyan, which are a race of forest entities in Malaysia that I actually talked about for the first time in a Trojan Feast. There was a guard who was taken and returned and remembered being taken to this magical palace and being fed this awesome, amazing food that he actually puked up and turned up to be worms and leaves and sticks and stuff that had been, cloaked with this glamour. So, obviously a fairy connection there as well. But there was an entire flap of child abductions in the 80s that were completely blamed on these Bunyan. They would not only take children, but would also cause miscarriages. And I go into some of those in the book. Another one that I think is really interesting and definitely worth a mention that I don't get to bring up that often are the Tengu of Japan, who tended to be these sort of shapeshifters who would live up on mountains. Like fairy folk, their food was a sham. There are examples of children who were taken and brought back and puked up animal dung that they said was great food that the Tengu had given them. Similarly, they enjoyed taking children. The Tengu would actually sometimes masquerade, like I said, as shapeshifters, but typically as a bird or sort of a forest hermit. One of my favorite stories was of a child who watched the Tengu dancing, and then something, quote unquote, like a net descended from the sky and drew it around all the dances, and the circular net was shooting flames and took them into the sky before the Tengu actually dropped them off back at home. And that sounds, a lot like not only fairy folk who used to dance in circles, but also, it sounds a lot like, I'm sure there are a lot of ufologists out there who would say UFO to that.
Right, of course.
Yeah. And then, of course, the jinn, which have probably the deepest connection to fairy lore. And it's not really all that surprising given the fact that they're both sort of, the lore that's accreted around them both comes from Abrahamic traditions, Islam being also, a religion that shares a lot of lore with Judaism. The jinn were said to inhabit old ruins, which is exactly what you see in the Celtic countries. They eat food that is just described as rubbish. They live long times. They fear iron. They fear loud noises. They cause missing time. It's interesting to see how the jinn, the development of the jinn in popular culture is sort of paralleled by the development of the fairy in popular culture. The jinn is now the friendly genie, and the fairy is now the friendly, Tinkerbell type fairy. But they would also leave changelings as well. And in fact, there are some stories that just sound like they're just right out of Ireland, where people realize that their child who's been taken, typically a young boy, they would actually dress not only like quick aside, to prevent fairy theft in Ireland, they would often dress boys as girls to fool the fairies. And you'll actually see something very similar in Muslim cultures, where they would actually refer to Muslim boys as in the feminine and dress them as girls until after a certain stage of life where they were less vulnerable. But anyway, that aside, the means of retrieving your child from being a changeling often paralleled Irish belief as well. You would abandon them in graveyards. Well, abandonment was a big common thing in Irish and Celtic folklore in terms of the means of retrieving your child. Similarly, they would abuse the changeling in the hopes that the jinn would deliver the mortal child back. So I mean, a lot of these shared traditions between a lot of cultures that really shouldn't have contact. I mean, there's a section in the book on Africa. There's a section in the book on some South American traditions, and then again Native American traditions. There are some comparisons as well as Mexico, the Caribbean. A lot of similarities between these cultures that just shouldn't have really cross pollinated all that much.
Yeah, especially with the little specifics.
Yeah, the weird tiny specifics. I mean, one could argue that if we're dealing solely with a set of tangible medical terms, or tangible medical conditions rather, that you see some of the similar descriptions popping up, but when the methods are the same, and like you said, the little things, the little details come up time and again, it definitely implies that there's some sort of shared objective reality, whatever that may be.
Yeah. And of course, as we talk about all this stuff, it's easy to make connections to the modern UFO era as well. So why do you think they're taking people?
That's a great idea. Or great question rather. I don't buy the bloodline angle. At least not as anything other than a metaphor. I don't buy ideas that we are a supernatural food source, really. I suspect, again, if you look at, as we mentioned earlier, the manner in which the the alien abductee mirrors the fairy abductee, mirrors the near-death experiencer, mirrors the shaman, I think that there is some. I think that it's trying to facilitate some sort of communication. I think that it's representative of the other, whatever that may be. It's a term I'm quite fond of using to describe this other intelligence. The other is for some reason reaching out to mankind, and like a child with a butterfly, sometimes it squeezes a little bit too hard. It gets a little bit complicated because I think that sometimes we misinterpret ability as disability, especially in the way that our society is wired to operate as well. I think there's a little bit of that going on too.
Okay. Well, do you want to get into that a little bit?
Well, I do, but I don't know if you wanted to talk about Bigfoot or something else first, or if we're going to split this into a two-parter.
We're going to have to split this into a two-parter because I have a whole list of stuff we still need to talk about, and we're almost out of time.
Okay, so I mean that's the reason I was being coy, is because I didn't want to. If I talk about that, you want it to be in part two, right?
Sure, we can do that. Well, to end this off, why don't you talk about the blinding motif with fairies and like the salve rubbed on people's eyes and stuff.
Okay, yeah. So one of the things that you sort of have to talk about when you talk about this concept of exchanging children and fairies wanting fairy milk is this midwife to the fairies motif that you'll find in a lot of Celtic cultures, but it's actually deeper. You'll find in antecedents in certain Judaic traditions and Scandinavian traditions as well. But the richest traditions you'll find in the Celtic countries. And typically this story is that, so there's sort of wet nurse to the fairy story and a midwife to the fairy story. The wet nurse to the fairy story is one that takes just very little imagination from what we've talked about already to extrapolate. So this is the idea that not only would fairy children be left with mortal women to nurse, but sometimes mortal women would be abducted to fairyland to nurse their child. Depending on the certain set of circumstances, the woman would either remain in fairyland, in which case she would die, or in some traditions, the woman was generally perceived as returning every night to her mortal home to nurse her mortal child. And through a series of elaborate rituals that I go into, a man could perhaps save his captive wife's life, and so she would no longer be a wet nurse to the fairies. Also, a rich tradition of midwives to the fairies. So this idea that fairies that human women were needed to help fairies give birth. Um, and in a lot of these stories, typically a strange person, sometimes literally a man in black, would appear at the door of a woman who was a midwife and would actually ask for help, in either in um, raising or delivering a child. And in these stories, the woman would go to oftentimes a fairy cavern or a fairy cave or a fairy mound, a fairy fort, and would see a beautiful habitat. See the fairy lady, would place her hands upon the fairy mother, because that was something that was required for the delivery of a fairy baby, was human touch. Um, and She would either help the fairy lady give birth and would leave with a reward, or she'd actually help the fairies raise their children for a sum. In these cases, and I'm generalizing because there are a lot of little different minor variations here and there, but in these cases, generally speaking, the fairy mother would be instructed to rub an ointment on her children that she was supervising, and to never ever touch it to her eye. And in some stories, curiosity gets the best of her and she touches her eye. In other stories, she's actually itching her eye. But somehow this ointment winds up in her eye, and she sees the fairy realm for what it is. And it really actually is horrible little creatures that she's taking care of, and this beautiful fairyland is actually a horrifying cave, and it's all revealed to be a sham. So she's either discharged or escapes, and years later, she sees the fairy gentleman who retrieved her out in public, typically at a market or a fair, and will acknowledge him. And by acknowledging him, the fairy man realizes that she so long ago put the ointment in her eyes because she can see him, and he ends up blinding her for the transgression. There are a couple of points that are really worth mentioning here. In regards to the modern abduction experience, it's not uncommon to find stories of women who claim to have been taken aboard UFOs to help raise fairy children, or to help them play as a way of helping them learn about the human world. Mm-hmm. Similarly, this motif of the mortal woman, the human, having to touch the fairy woman to deliver birth is mirrored in the hybrid baby presentation that you see in a lot of hybridization stories about UFOs, where an alien abductor will produce a hybrid child to an abductee, and the abductee is implored to touch the child. So this idea that human touch has some sort of intrinsic value. And also, this idea of this sort of ointment. In A Trojan Feast, I talked for a good bit about the concept of not only entheogens sort of revealing the true nature of the world, but also how in a lot of these, these hybrid stories in the modern abduction realm, sometimes abductees are asked to rub a liquid or a fluid on the hybrid baby. So these are, again, all really specific motifs that show up so often that I have trouble. I used to be really coy about it and say, oh, maybe they're not describing the same thing, but I've reached the point now where I think that fairy lore is definitely describing the same thing as our modern contact experience. I don't know exactly what it is. I don't think it's fairies. I don't think it's aliens. I think it's something different, but whatever it is, I think they're both pointing in the same direction.
I would agree. All right, so this book is by far probably your best-selling book, right?
So far, so good. Knock on wood. It seems to be very well received. I'll say that.
Is it still available?
Yes. Let's get the word out about this. So there's been some shenanigans with Amazon saying that they've been prioritizing third-party sellers. Whatever you do, whomever you buy it from, it's available on Barnes & Noble and Amazon, but make sure that you're not paying make sure you're finding the cheapest price. I guess it's the safest thing to say, because there were some people that were selling it on third party for literally like 150% of its original price. So that's item number one. Item number two is that you might see that it says it's out of stock. This is malarkey. Anomalous Books is a print-on-demand operation. They're just fulfilling Amazon requests, so it's not a matter of being in stock or not. Amazon keeps some on hand, but as soon as they run out, the order goes straight to Anomalist. So if you want it, it's out there, paperback and Kindle. If it's anything like the last 2 books, hardcover should be on its way.
Oh, okay, cool. You did have some immediate rush on this book where you did have trouble keeping it in stock, correct?
Yes, I mean it's I think that everybody. I think maybe I was hyping it too much because as soon as it dropped, everybody was sort of scrambling to pick it up. So there was some confusion. It's all sorted out now. I've had some people say, "Oh, it said it's out of stock and it showed up in 3 days," and I'm like, "Yep, that's because it's not the same sort of situation." So basically, my advice is order regardless of in stock status and find the cheapest price. There you go. And I will say, if the cheapest price means you buying it from someone who's read it and is putting it back up for sale, go ahead and do that. That's totally fine.
Is there a digital version as well?
Yes, Kindle's out.
Okay.
I'm not sure if there are any other formats. If they are not out already, I'm sure they're forthcoming.
All right, and we will do the next part next week where we're going to talk about Thunderbirds, Bigfoot, hypnosis, missing fetus syndrome, hybrids, indigo and star children, and more missing 411 stuff. It's going to be an interesting second part.
Plenty to talk about, that's for sure.
All right, thanks, Josh.
Sorry.
I want to thank everyone who supports the show, particularly our Patreons, without which the show would not be anywhere near the quality it is today. But in particular, people pledging $10 or more: Super Inframan, Samantha, Mark Brady, Allison Cook, Craig Cisneros, Donna Beveridge, Sasha Lorg, Christopher Vaughn, Robert Groom, Scott Morris Everett, Chris Elmquist, Russell Wilcoxon, Andy McNamara, Patricia Gayaquinta, John Eddy, Alfred Tuttle, Kevin Schreck, and Carla Mahoney. Thank you all so very much. All right, so that was part 1 of that conversation. Part 2, I think we're recording Monday, so as soon as I have it in a presentable form, I will upload it for Patreons. Everyone else will get it next week. And there's a lot of more interesting stuff to talk about. Again, I highly recommend the book. It's well worth the read. It's long, but it's an easy read, and there's just so much stuff packed into it. So until next time. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.